Again, I warn you just a little bit. This is intellectual history again. You guys remember what that means? I don't know. Maybe I talked about that in U.S. history, not in this class. What is intellectual history? In fact, I think I did do it in U.S. history, not in this class. Go ahead.
It's more about history of ideas.
History of ideas, okay? And that's really critical. Hopefully, last Monday, you got the main point of the lecture. And the main point of the lecture, okay, good. The main point of yesterday's, or Monday's lecture was that England had a huge influence beginning around 1800, and most of that influence had to do with constitutionalism. The constitutional revolution is what we usually refer to it, not always, but from 1600 to 1700. France never had that constitutionalism, and so because they were not able to have some venting of this frustration that was building up, what happens to them in 1789? Revolution, right? I mean, not just a little revolution, a big, giant, horrible revolution that is so chaotic that out of this revolution, Napoleon arises. And the rest of Europe may be concerned about the revolution, but they're really concerned about Napoleon because he ends up taking over all of Europe. Irony of all irony, right? So they have this revolution in 1789, and I'm not going to go too much into it. This is more of a Western civ thing, but there's two stages of this French Revolution, two revolutions. The first one is when all the nobles and the peasants, and remember, when we talk about peasants, we're not talking about people who scoop poop for a living. We're talking about wealthy businessmen for the most part. The people that are urbanized that do not have any titles. So the peasants and the nobles, they go to the king, say, we're in terrible economic straits, you can no longer lead. So they depose the king. This is the storming the Bastille and things like this. It's not very bloody. It's not very bloody. So the first part of the revolution is when the nobles and the peasants, we're talking businessmen, depose the king. The second part of the revolution happens about 2 years later, and that's more radical. They overthrow not just the king, but they're trying to overthrow the entire social system. This is when you start inventing the guillotine and you start killing people en masse. They call it the Reign of Terror from 1791 to 1792. It's later. This is what causes Europe to be concerned. The fact that the king was deposed, England said, well, it's about time. A lot of English observers are saying, well, it's about time because they're living in a backward age. But when 1791, 1792, in the Reign of Terror, and they're killing people just because they have wealth, and the radicalism, they're trying to overturn everything that society has. They're trying to recreate the calendar because they thought that it was too religious. And so the king was based off of a religious identity. If you get rid of the king, you get rid of the church. If you get rid of the church, then you can start from scratch. So genuine radical ideology. So you're killing just lines and lines of people. The guillotine is invented to kill them quicker because you can't chop heads off quick enough. So Reign of Terror. Out of this, many of the French are upset by this. You have kind of an internal civil war. Out of that internal civil war, Napoleon rises up to help to quash this. And in the process, this is the irony, in the process, he is so effective. All the other European countries attacked France when they killed the king. Napoleon uses this as an opportunity to attack back, and by 1800 he has a huge handle on Europe and in Italy. By 1812 he has most of Europe. The irony again is that in 1789 they overthrow the king. In 1800 they crown Napoleon emperor. They crown Napoleon emperor. He's the emperor, right? Same people. And he calls himself a revolutionary reformer. He's not. He's just not. But this is really important for us to understand, because what you have here is a delayed constitutionalism. France did not have this constitutional revolution between 1600 and 1700 that England had. They had it all at one time, and because it was very chaotic. It's important because for Western Civ, and again, we're not spending too much time on Western Civ, for most of the 1800s, you have Europe oscillating between an attempt to try to entertain and somehow accommodate the new constitutionalism and another force to try to end radicalism, because nobody wants radicalism. And so you go from being what we'd call conservative, which is we got to push down all the radicals, to being liberal, which would mean that we want to have more constitutionalism. The problem is that every time you go into the constitutionalism, you end up having radicals rising up and having riots, which does what? Means that everybody has to quash the radicalism. So we go back. We need more order. And that's okay, but then you go a little bit too extreme and you're quashing everything, which then leads up this desire for reform. You can see this happening about every 15 to 20 years. Every time they go back and forth, they find a little bit more of a middle ground. But you have, on the one side, the desire for order, and then on the other side, a desire for change. And Europe is racked by this. Now, again, I'm not really talking a lot about Western Civ today, but you guys are kind of smart, and I'm not going to talk about U.S. history. But how many social revolutions do we have in the United States? None. Why not? Even our American Revolution, is that a social revolution? Where we try to kind of overturn the fabric of society? No, it's purely political. Purely political. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, right? And if the government exists to protect these rights. If the government does not protect these rights, then we must either change the government or abolish it. Either change it or abolish it. You know, Declaration of Independence listed all the times when our rights are violated. Next paragraph. All the times when we tried to change it. Next paragraph. King never did it. And so, since they never did it, our duty is to separate the connection between me and thee. We declare ourselves independent. It's a complete kind of a expression of the sentiment. Why don't we have the social revolutions that plagued France? We could argue, why doesn't England have it after 1688? But we kind of understand this. This was an 88-year process in England to have this constitutionalism. Why did we never have this in the United States? Take a guess.
The colony wanted to separate from that.
Yeah, we had a political revolution. We separated, but why not a social revolution?
Because we already had like the laws in place, and the England never had anything.
No, kind of close, It's kind of a rhetorical question. I want you to be thinking about. I'll give you an answer. Again, we're not talking about U.S. history here or Western Civ, but I'll just tell you here. So here's England. Here's Europe. Spain. Here is the United States. Obviously not to scale. I'll go ahead and put something. Okay. So Europe has a history that dates from around 500 to 1500. And what was Europe from 500 to 1500? What was that era referred to as? Medieval period, right? It was defined by feudalism. Remember, no modern nation states. So it's a feudal era. And so we're looking at 1,000 years. And that includes not only Europe, but also England. Okay? So when the United States is formed, who is moving over to the United States? Now, yes, we get actually people from all over Europe. Most of them are from England, but but absolutely they're from all over Europe. Who's going there? Are we getting the poorest of the poor?
No.
No. Why not? Super easy. They're poor.
Yes.
They can't afford the ticket, right? Super easy. Are we getting the super rich?
No.
Why?
We didn't want to die.
It's hard out here. They have no desire. They have their own estates. They have their own aristocratic history. There's no urgency. So what we're really getting here are the Midland sorts. Okay? The Midland. And this is not a word, so I'll put it in quotes. But the Midland sorts. And the wonderful thing about the Midland sorts is that they are almost all literate. It's a big deal. They can all read, for the most part. But we're talking 95%. Okay, what's the literacy rate in England? Well, among the Midland groups, probably in the upper 90s, right? Among the aristocrats, probably in the upper 90s or higher. What about the poorer folks? Rural farmer types? No, we're talking maybe, okay? So, what about in France? When we're talking about this revolution, 1789, who is pushing for the second reign of terror? Are we actually having the guys with pitchforks and poop, going? No. They are the ones that are being led by mostly students, academics. Their literacy rate is much less. Even among the Midland sorts, you're looking at a literacy rate probably closer to 60%, right? And for the lower folks, most do not read. The aristocrats have a lower, even still, than the Midland, but it's not a huge part. Now, of course, among academics, everybody reads. So why doesn't the U.S.? Well, because Europe and England has 1,000 years to get past. England has the advantage because it's an island state, right? They can kind of have a little bit more control, so they can kick out the king, they can bring in somebody else. They have James I, who's absolute, Charles I, who's an absolute. He loses his head. They have this big civil war under Cromwell. And then Charles II comes in saying, well, I won't be so absolute. And then James II says, I'm going back to absolutism. And then the Glorious Revolution. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit more controlled. They are able to have this intellectual tradition. The people who are leading this tradition are also some of the people that are going over to the colonies, at least nearby. The people in the colonies are fully aware of the philosophers that helped to promote this Enlightenment, this revolution in England. So when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, he is using John Locke, who writes in 1688, that's the revolution, he actually writes 1692, doesn't matter. Thomas Jefferson is writing in 1776, 100 years later. The words he used, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the creator certain unalienable rights. He's taking a 2-paragraph section from John Locke's treatise on civil government, and he's reducing it to a nice thing. Everybody who reads this knows exactly where it came from. They all know. And not only everybody in England, well, when I say everybody in England, certainly the aristocrats, the people in Parliament, they all know what he's talking about, but we all know. So the U.S. doesn't have this legacy. So once we have the political revolution, we just hit the ground running. When do we get universal suffrage for men? Not counting slaves, because slaves weren't considered. But you guys do realize that even before the Civil War, blacks could vote in certain states. If you're a slave, you're not considered a citizen. But if you're a citizen, then you could vote, right? When did we get this? Like 1820s. Immediately, most people were able to vote. But we did have some property requirements. We did have some, especially in the Northeast. But by the time you get to Andrew Jackson, his whole argument is that everybody should vote on everything. This is a radical idea compared to the world at the time. Nobody was doing that. England slowly expanded their voting rolls. Slowly expanding their voting rolls. They did this in the 1850s, and then they did it again in the 1870s, but they don't really complete this until the 19-teens. Yes, Maria?
Yeah, but then didn't they have a problem like in Rome where they tried to vote for everything and then they had to come up with
Yeah, no, we're not talking about direct democracy. The point is that you vote for people who will then vote for you. It's still an indirect, it's still a republic. The point is what they were doing, the way they were expanding voting rights in England is that they were lowering the property rights. So at first, you voted if you had a title. This goes back to James I. The Parliament is made up of the nobles. By the end of the Glorious Revolution, you're beginning to also recognize wealthy peasants, right? So then if you have an estate, if you have a lot of property, you have skin in the game, you get to vote. So we shift from the titles to some type of estates, certain amount of property. This means that you've done something in society, you are a stakeholder in society. Well, we reduce that to maybe not an estate, but some type of property. Maybe you have a house in the city. Maybe you have a big house in the city. You then also have a stake. And slowly, England expands the voting rolls by limiting this. Then finally you say, well, okay, as long as you have an address, okay? Now, to us, we look at this, we say, well, of course everyone should vote. But you have to look at this from their perspective, not our modern perspective. At the time, in the United States, people like Andrew Jackson would say everybody should vote, because when he's talking about everybody, who is he talking about? These middling that almost everybody is literate. They all can read a newspaper. They all know what the issues are. They all can be informed voters. When you're talking about, say, France, how many of these guys know what the issues are? Even in England, how many of them really can make an informed decision? This is something that's a very real situation. We had reformers that said in the very first part of the French Revolution, the king is doing a terrible job, we need to depose the king, 1789. And then these radicals come in. And the way the radicals work is that they kind of harness all the peasants, not the wealthy peasants, but the really poor peasants, and say, they're taking stuff away from you. And mostly, if you look at the history, it's not the rural peasants, it's not the farmers, it's the urban peasants. High unemployment, not a lot of money, and they say, well, you don't have any money because the wealthy people took it from you. And so we kind of use them as a sort of an army. Now, this is not unusual for us. I don't want to make modern comments and stuff, but all these high school kids that are being very politically active, are they actually being politically active? No, they're people that are kind of directing. The same exact thing is happening in the French Revolution. It's not really the peasants that are coming up with these ideas. There's people that are feeding it to them. And the reason why this is important is that people look at reform and they say, if you give the poop scooper a right to vote, he's only going to vote for things that are selfish. He doesn't know about the interests of the state as a whole. He only knows about what he wants. He sees that guy's got money, he doesn't have any money, I want his money. So we can't give the poop scooper, the illiterate poop scooper, the right to vote, because if we do, you're going to have a reign of terror again. And it's not a completely unfounded fear. When we have Alexis de Tocqueville, you guys have all heard the name, you may not remember why you hear it. He wrote a book called Democracy in America. He's French. He's a French, kind of a pseudo-aristocrat from 1830. This is a time when we're kind of going back to the reform era. We're going back and forth. He goes to the United States and he's saying, why hasn't the United States had these revolutions? Because we seem to have them all the time in France. We have one revolution, they quash it, we have some order, and then we have it again, and they quash. Why isn't the United States doing this? His conclusion was that the United States was very, very religious. The United States had a sense of kind of belonging to groups and organizations. And so everyone felt like they were actually part of the process. And more than anything, almost everyone's literate. So because of this, the United States hasn't had this. Now, de Tocqueville's actually surprised by these results, because back home, the assumption is if you give the poor the vote, you'll have revolution. The reason why I'm saying this over and over again is that this is a very real problem that they're worrying about. This shift from the constitutionalism, where we want change, constantly being fought by this radicalism, and the antidote to radicalism is order. It goes back and forth because in European history, they did not make this transition very freely. And if you really think about it, did the English transition come without bloodshed? No, nor was it easy, right? It took them another 80 years. The United States kind of a bit spoiled, if you think about it, because they are the children of the people that did all the work in England. They didn't have to create the theories. The theories were already there. Thomas Jefferson takes the ideas that are already there, and that's where we get our American Revolution. But we don't have to fight and overturn all these traditions. In Europe, that's exactly what they're having to do all the time. And the fear is you've got all these people that are really genuinely uneducated, and they will lead to radicalism. So here's this other little weird situation. And this is the point that I was trying to make last class, and hopefully you'll get it. Your textbooks are really funny on this subject. This is all about Enlightenment ideals. Political discussion we're going to talk about today is industrialization. There is a connection between industrialization and the Enlightenment. Okay? In fact, I would argue that the reason why England becomes the birthplace of industrialization, and industrialization does not come around until 1790s. We'll explain what it is. We'll give you the definition. The reason why England is the birthplace of industrialization is that England had already done the constitutional revolution between 1600 and 1688. So that this constitutionalism leads to industrialization. But it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing. We'll talk about this today. It's one of our main focus. Once you become industrialized, what do you begin to demand? Again, you don't have a definition. I'll just give you a quick definition. Definition means that you have fewer people making things by hand, more things being made by machines, which means most of the people are working in jobs, set hours, set wages. You get money. Not a lot. You're not wealthy, right? But you have money. So you don't have to be making and buying things in order to get money. If you are a peasant in the Middle Ages, how much money do you have? You don't have money, but how much money do you need? You don't need money because you're there on this guy's thing. You do the farming, you give him a cut of it. It's an exchange, more of a barter exchange. Once you get urbanized, you're living in a city, you have to have money to be buying. That means that you could be poor, but what's the positive side? What's the good side? You have more jobs and you have more money, then how willing are you to accept all these old-fashioned expectations of these hierarchies? I'm going to give you this thought here. Industrialization then promotes constitutionalism. I'm going to tell you, your textbooks are not going to make this link. Part of it is that they like to do things in one period at a time. They don't like to see big picture ideas. Part of it is a lot of these guys don't like industrialization. I don't need to get into explaining why, but they don't. And so when you talk about industrialization, the rise of factories, you're going to talk about how everybody is miserable. But read these sections, what I want you to be looking for is, okay, they say that they're miserable. What are they always crying for? More votes. Why weren't they crying for votes 200 years earlier?
Because they didn't have any money that could actually be considered themselves a voter.
Well, if you're a poop scooper, you really are a poop scooper, right? And your dad's been a poop scooper, and your grandpa was a poop scooper, because you're in the estate. You're the peasant on the landed estate, right? That's your job. And in fact, you're kind of honored that you have that position. Do you think about how much money you're missing? No. Do you think about all the rights and the freedoms you're missing? No. Because you're just there on the landed estate. It's not until you leave that landed estate, you start living on your own, paying for your own stuff, then you start thinking, I work really hard, I should have these results. Industrialization does bring out the prospect of poverty, but it also brings out the prospect of greater independence. And independence is a really close word to freedom. Okay, you got the point. What order is this in?
It's actually right in order.
It's exactly in order. It's exactly in order, okay? And there is a causal connection that you should get here. I don't have it here. The agricultural revolution is actually pretty early. We're looking at 1100s to 1200s. It is one of the causes that kind of helps to bring in Renaissance, the rebirth. Now this is an agricultural revolution that's not just affecting England, but also Europe. It's coinciding at the same time with a trade revolution, mostly in lower Europe. You're trading more goods, you have this agricultural revolution. These two things are both encouraging the greater resources, and greater resources then mean you have more people, which means that you have more trade goods. Both of these are coming off of it, which also means that you actually have more money. All of this comes off the agricultural revolution, which indirectly, if you put it all down, it also means that you have more, I don't know if I can say leisure time, but I will. I'll say more leisure time. I'm not actually meaning leisure like you're sitting around playing video games. You're sitting around doing what? Thinking, coming up with ideas. That's, from this, is where you're going to get the scientific revolution. Now, the scientific revolution is not an overnight thing. You can look at this, I would say, somewhere between 1450, and I would say it's no longer a revolution by the 1650s. In other words, by this time, everybody is following it. The scientific revolution, I'm going to explain this very specifically in a second. We are looking at 14 to around Isaac Newton. By the time Isaac Newton is there, we are into sciences. Right? You guys all know this from just knowing Newtonian physics. From the scientific revolution, we get the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, again, I will define this specifically, we're looking at roughly 1650s to around 1800s. 1650s, because many of the ideals of the Enlightenment are there in England with the Petition of Rights in 1621. Certainly are there with the with the Glorious Revolution 1688. John Locke, absolutely there. John Locke, then Voltaire. Then you got these French guys, the French Enlightenment people in the 1750s. Then you've got Thomas Jefferson, the American Revolution. Then you've got the French Revolution. So this is the sequence of events. You can't get this application of scientific principles unless you have the scientific revolution. You can't get the scientific revolution unless you've just got more people and more resources. That's causal connection. Let me make sure you have some definitions here. This is where it's the ideas that we're working on. Okay? So let's make sure that you get this. First of all, definition of enlightenment. It's a movement. So it's a movement. It's an intellectual thing. It's a movement of ideas. Okay? A movement that applied scientific methodology to solve social problems. That's an easy definition. It doesn't mean very much unless you understand what scientific methodology is. So I give you a definition for scientific methodology. It's using inductive reasoning to solve natural problems. Inductive instead of deductive. Here we have a problem, and I'm not spending a lot of time on this because we have other things to discuss, but you've got to understand. Two different types of reasoning. Here we have a problem, and I'm not spending a lot of time on this because we have other things to discuss, but you've got to understand. Two different types of reasoning. I don't think I've talked about it in this class yet. Don't think so. But this is the essence of the scientific revolution. A shift from deductive to inductive reasoning. Now, Western Civ, we talk a lot about this because this becomes a problem even today. In a very, I hesitate to do this because I know you guys are going to screw this up, but it's a nice way of understanding it in our modern language. Just realize that when I'm talking about this in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, this doesn't apply. But in our modern language, you'll understand. Deductive reasoning is what we use when we are reasoning with faith. Inductive reasoning is what we use when we are reasoning in science. Okay? I'm gonna use this. Please be careful. Okay? Because the meanings are a little bit, technically they're different. But in this case, it helps you to understand. So, let me give you an example. Sometimes people will make a mistake and they'll say something like, the scientific revolution was the time when they started to use reasoning. What's wrong with that statement?
Because the science have to almost, like, they almost have to work hand in hand, otherwise you wouldn't believe in something that you could.
Okay, you're close. Jason?
Well, people have always used reason.
You always use reasoning. This is where it's not irrational to believe in faith. You understand this? The Middle Ages was absolutely dominated by deductive reasoning. That's kind of one of the things that defines the Middle Ages. Even in the Renaissance, mostly it was defined by deductive reasoning. The modern era is defined by the dominance of inductive reasoning. This college, when I ask you to write a paper, I'm asking you to use inductive reasoning. You make observations, use specific evidence. From those evidence, you come up with a generalization. I'll explain this in a second. But it's not irrational to have arguments of faith. It's a different kind of reason. So I give you two examples. So for deductive, think of Sherlock Holmes. And it's funny because if you ever read the Sherlock Holmes, he's always talking about using scientific methods for his cases. But in fact, he relies a great deal on deductive reasoning. He's the one that said, if you eliminate all possibilities, all other possibilities, the only one that remains, no matter how far-fetched, is the answer. Have you heard that line before? Yeah, totally coming out of Sherlock Holmes' mouth. This is what's his face writing. Okay, that is the definition of deductive reasoning. Just think about it. Eliminate all other possibilities. What you've got is the answer. That's deductive. You're deducing. You're removing the possibilities that can't work until you come up with your answer. Now, that's very rational. And when Sherlock Holmes uses this is totally scientific, right? It's deductive. He walks into a room, he sees the dead body, and then he looks around for the clues. And he starts looking at all the possibilities and then systematically removes those that can't work. That's deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, by a definition, means that you start with a truth, you work through alternatives, eliminating inconsistencies or contradictions. And you arrive at an explanation. Sherlock Holmes does not have to prove the guy's dead. And usually he doesn't have to prove that he got murdered, although that may be part of the fun mystery. But let's assume we know that he's dead, he knows the murder. What's he looking for? How did it happen? You start with the truth and you arrive at an explanation. That's deductive reasoning. Okay. Inductive. Scientific method. And I don't know if you guys have had your labs yet, but you've seen this a million times. I chose this model because it looks like it's, for 6th graders. But didn't you get something like this in 6th grade? I mean, isn't that when they first introduced the whole concept? You're 6th grade, you don't quite catch it when you're 6th grade. But then when you're in 9th grade, and then you're actually doing things in 10th and 11th or 12th grade, and then in college, you're applying it, you do labs. It's over and over again. You come up with an idea, and you have a hypothesis. And if you didn't get this then, you should get it now. When you do a laboratory experiment, your purpose is to disprove the hypothesis. You're trying to prove the hypothesis wrong. Why is that?
Because if you can't prove it wrong, it means that it's probably right.
Well, it's not necessarily right, it's stronger. If you can prove it wrong, what does it mean? It's flat wrong. Okay, there's nothing, you're done, you end that. In a weird sense, it's a little bit like deductive reasoning, except in this case, you come up with a hypothesis and then you observe. You observe everything around you, and you take nothing for granted. You don't start with any truth here. You start with observations. Start with observations. That's what this guy's got the You start with observations. Then you test them. A hypothesis. Now, if it turns out that the hypothesis is wrong, then you move to another. If yes, does that mean that you're right? No. No, you're not, right? It just means that it's a stronger hypothesis. So what do you have to do again? You have to repeat it again and again and again. And you guys are right. Eventually, this hypothesis may turn into a theory. But is the theory right?
No, it's just something that was proven over and over again.
It just means that you haven't come up with a way of yet disproving it. But it's still a theory.
And then it becomes a law if there's
Well,
a law of gravity.
no, but a law is still a theory. Right?
Yes.
So here, let's get this question. Which one of these two pieces of processes of reasoning gives you more certainty?
You can see more science. You can
More certainty. Why?
Because you're actually testing things, you're not just looking around and eliminating them.
It's true. And that's the way our modern society would say. It is kind of a hallmark, a defining characteristic of our modern society. But what's wrong with that? When you have your theory, does this mean this is absolute true? Doesn't it mean that you just haven't disproven it yet? So do you have full certainty here? What about using deductive reasoning?
It can come up, like anybody can like pick out something that they want.
You start with truth. This has way more certainty because you're not trying to prove the truth. You're not trying to prove the truth. You're just trying to provide an explanation. That's different. This is even bigger. And again, I'm spending even more time on this than I want to, but I'll say inductive reasoning, modern era, scientific method, natural world. And when I say natural world, what I really meant is the material world. Things that you can touch and measure. Why is it critical that it's something that is tangible? How do you test an intangible?
The air is intangible.
Beauty. Beauty. I can come up with a reasonable argument that might explain beauty. Can I really test for it?
You can make
It's
up
funny because psychologists try to do this all the time, right? Is beauty really in the eye of the beholder? Can you? It's an intangible. You can recognize when something or someone or even an idea is beautiful, but you can't prove it. You start recognizing it's beautiful, and then you try to explain where it came from. How about this? This is an even better one. God. Can you prove that God exists?
You can, but not everyone will reason.
I can certainly come up with an explanation. Lots of them. I absolutely can. But can I test?
You shouldn't.
How about this? Easier. Can I prove that God doesn't exist?
No.
No! Because the fact that I don't see him, he's immaterial. This is immaterial. It's two different types of reasoning. Today, we use both of them, even though this gets short shrift. The fact is, on matters of faith and morals, we still rely mostly on deductive reasoning. God exists. If God exists, then we assume he created the world. If he created the world, then we assume that he had some purpose in that creation. If he has some purpose in that creation, and if he actually cares about us, then it makes sense that he somehow revealed himself to us to be able to find out that purpose. This is deductive reasoning. And you can have lots, really big, giant books that talk about all this type of stuff. And during the Middle Ages, we had hundreds of those books. We didn't have a lot of books talking about the science. So, perfect example, again, I only have like 5 minutes on this. Less, 2 minutes. If I'm a farmer sitting in my field, and I see the sun rising, and then I see it setting, what is the obvious truth that I can deduce from this?
Sun's going around.
Isn't it just screamingly obvious? This is not something the church made up. The idea that the earth is the center of the universe goes back to the Greeks long before Judeo-Christian. Because you see it rising and it's super easy. But of course, then there's a problem. If you really look, if we are the center, then everything should be going around us. And people before television, radio, they spent their times looking at the stars, and they could track the stars. Astrology was basically synonymous with astronomy. You could see the things, and if you really are observing, what you notice is that these planets don't just go around. Some of them go this way, and then some of them go backwards, called retrograde motion. Not only planets do this, but we see this with stars. And so how do we explain this? Observation. Well, we're supposed to be in the center. Around 1400, Copernicus comes up with this idea, if we just rotate. And the funny thing is, don't get me wrong, Copernicus is not a scientist using inductive reasoning. He's only using deductive reasoning. He was an alchemist. He's trying to turn lead into gold. He's trying to seek the secret of eternal life. He's trying to understand the universe so that he can understand basically how to get more out of it. He says if we just replace the Earth with the sun, we might be able to better explain this retrograde motion. Now the problem is he still assumed that everything is orbiting in perfect circles. So it still doesn't make any sense. But he introduces the idea. Later, a guy named Kepler says, well, what if we made it not circles but ellipticals? But that doesn't make any sense. Because for 1,000 years, more than that, in fact, before the church, way back in Ptolemy times, we knew that the world is in the center and everything is more perfect the further out you get. Now that's deductive reasoning. You start knowing that we're the center because you see the sun coming up and down. That's a truth. Why? Because God created the world and we're the most important part in it. That makes sense. A plan of salvation, he dies for us. Of course we're the most important part. And so the higher up you go, the closer to God, things are more perfect. Circles are way more perfect than it is elliptical. And so of course as you get old, it's more perfect circle. So you're having to fight these ideas. But they're ideas based on deductive reason, not inductive. Kepler and Galileo. Galileo invents the telescope. Kepler's using lenses. He ends up dying because he's grinding glass, gets into soap. But he doesn't invent the telescope. Galileo invents the telescope and then uses the telescope to show a bunch of things. The first one, he looks up at the moon, he sees there's craters on the moon. Craters on the moon? That's not perfect. Not only that, he looks and he sees there's moons around Jupiter. How could that be? How could you have two different sets that's not perfect either? And then the biggest one, this is really the proof. He looks at Venus, and through the telescope, you can actually see phases of Venus. And I don't want to get into the geometry, but if you're looking at the sun and the Earth and Venus, if Venus is between you and the sun, the phases will be different. And it will be impossible to get certain phases if Earth is in the center and the sun is going around. Impossible. By doing this, he's able to prove with inductive reasoning, based off observations, that the Earth is not the center. The sun is the center. You can do this because you can see the phases of Venus. Inductive reasoning helps the material world. What does it do about whether or not man is still the center of creation? Does it prove or disprove it? No, it has no impact on it at all. But, unfortunately for Galileo, he's introducing this idea right in the middle, and we talked about this first unit, right in the middle of these wars of Reformation. Now again, you know the answer to this. Are the wars of Reformation really about theology? No. They're totally about politics. And so one theological thing over another isn't really going to change the wars. It's about whether or not France is going to be independent, or England's going to be independent, or the northern German states are going to be independent from the southern German. It's all about politics. And in the midst of this political fighting, Galileo comes up with something that seems to overthrow everything that the church has taught. Now remember, the church did not invent this. People in the dawn of time looked and they see the sun rising and setting. It's obvious. Now this is a horribly mistreated version or an epic in history. I don't know how many times I heard on the radio just last week. People said, well, Galileo, he was persecuted, tortured because of his beliefs. I don't know how many people get this. If you read Galileo, this isn't the truth. Galileo willingly recanted.
He spoke out about it.
He says this is the idea, and the church says, no, that's really dangerous. Not dangerous like we're afraid of science, but dangerous because what you're going to do at a time when there's all these wars, you are undermining basically what everybody knows. You're telling the farmer that what he sees with his own eyes is not real. Is this going to contribute to peace between the political conflicts, or is it going to contribute to even more chaos? What you see is not real. And Galileo, very smart guy, also, by the way, very religious. All of these scientific revolutionary folks, very religious. He insisted, I'm right. The earth spins. We're not in the center. I am right. But I will recant. And I'll recant because that farmer that's sitting on the field doesn't know what I know. He's not literate. I cannot explain to him in a way that he'll understand. So when I tell him that what he sees isn't real, I am questioning everything he believes in. And right now, it's a horrible thing to do. Galileo was not tortured. He wasn't threatened with death. It's just in the middle of a very strong political revolutions all over Europe. And he, being religious, says, I'll retract it. I'm not wrong, but I'll retract it for the sake of all those people that don't know what I'm talking about. Now, 100 years later, all these wars of religion are done. What does the church do to Galileo? You're right. Sorry, big apology. Newton, Isaac Newton, religious guy or not religious guy? Very religious guy. He comes up with an explanation for why the earth is the center, and it's gravity. The sun is huge. Everybody is being attracted into the sun. He's giving an explanation. He doesn't get any threat of excommunication or anything, but then again, he's also has the luxury of presenting the 1700s when there are no more of these wars of religion. The political states have already been established for the most part. Different era. The church says, boy, we're so sorry about Galileo, but it was a different era. This is important because today, funny thing, people use this as an explanation to say, well, deductive reason is anti-science. And it's not. It never has been. They are parallel tracks. So even today, people can be men of faith, use deductive reasoning on terms of faith and morals, and also be men of science and use inductive reasoning on issues that relate to the material world. Good. How does this have anything to do with the Industrial Revolution? I'm so glad you asked. Good. How does this have anything to do with the Industrial Revolution? I'm so glad you asked. The Enlightenment is when we apply scientific methodology to solve social problems. Let's just take John Locke's idea. Okay? John Locke is a child of the Enlightenment. He is, by the way, on the opposite side of a guy named Thomas Hobbes. The funny thing is that both of these guys are Enlightenment thinkers, but they have completely different views. Thomas Hobbes is there to explain why James I should be absolute. And if you remember, John Locke was there a little bit later, quite a bit later, to explain why William and Mary, after the Glorious Revolution, ought to be constitutional. From Hobbes' argument, he says, the world is naturally chaotic. Governments exist to restore or to create order. Order provides the rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, private property, anything like that. Therefore, governments, who is responsible for the order, can give or take rights at any time. That makes sense? Super easy argument. That's why James I has to be an absolute ruler, because he's order. Remember, this isn't the first time you've heard about this order versus reform idea. This is the argument that those aristocrat types are going to be using. That you need to have a strong hand, because if you don't, you're going to have the reign of terror. Now, okay, Hobbes is like 150 years, 200 years before the reign of terror, but you get what I'm saying. It's not a new argument. John Locke, different argument. Okay? Basically, men were created with rights. Because God created us all equal. The tabula rasa, if you look in psychology, we're all created basically the same. And so, if that's the case, governments exist only to protect those rights. That's why they exist. We all have these rights. If government fails, then you have to alter or change the government. And if you can't, if no change, then you must change, or I should say, abolish the government. You can see how this justifies the Glorious Revolution in eliminating James II and putting in William and Mary. In this case, governments cannot give or eliminate rights. And this is very important, without due process. What does that mean? Seems like a technical term, but what does that mean? Go ahead.
I took a civic class.
So what does that mean?
So like we have checks and balances.
Okay, kind of. I'm looking for a quick. We don't have that much time. Jason.
You have to be tried by.
You have to be shown to have forfeited those rights. They are innate. But what if I steal something from somebody else? I violated their rights. And since I violated their rights, what have I done to my own rights? I forfeited them. And how do you know if I stole something? We have a trial, peers, attorneys, impartial judges. That's the due process. It also, if you look really careful, you have to alter or change. Does this mean that every once in a while we should tell the king, hey, you're doing things wrong? What's the best way to constantly be changing the government to make sure that we never lose our rights? Now, keep in mind, this is a concept that Thomas Jefferson really likes. It's also a concept that people like Andrew Jackson really likes, right? Elections. We should be constantly voting. If somebody's not taking care of us as we think, we can vote them out. So if we do that, we don't have to have ever a revolution, because we can use the process of government as it is. Does that make sense? Now keep in mind, when John Locke is saying this, he's talking about really the aristocrats. He's not talking about the poop scoopers. This is still 1688 is the Glorious Revolution. It's another 100 years before the French Revolution, so he's not worried yet about the Reign of Terror. But both of these ideas are kind of governing how we're dealing with political reform and political change. And eventually we're going to say, well, we should have lots of elections so that the people are able to make sure that their rights are not hurt, damaged, they're protected. And if we do that, we can always avoid this revolution. That's the way we keep peace. This other side said, no. The problem is that you give people too many rights. That's really like opening up the door to chaos. And the more chaos there is, you need somebody to quash it down, which is exactly what they point to the Reign of Terror being. These two ideas dominate. Now, in the end, you guys are very smart. Which idea wins? It's obviously John Locke. But when? I will make this argument. Not really until World War II. Because isn't this Hobbesian argument kind of what Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and Stalin really rest on? Not Stalin in terms of his rhetoric, but in practice. You have to have a strong dictatorship. Stalin said it was a dictatorship of the people. Hitler said we have to have a dictatorship of the people too, but of a different kind. Mussolini, I'm just going to be strong. Because if I don't have the strength, there's disorder and there's chaos. Well, the opposite side, England, France, the United States, no. If you want to avoid chaos, why don't you give the people the rights? And why don't you protect the rights. And then they don't have to have this venting. Now, in my mind, I could be wrong on this, but in my mind, history kind of proves this side. But world history. Now, how does this connect to Industrial Revolution? We got 3 minutes. Super easy. The whole essence of the Enlightenment. Now, how does this connect to Industrial Revolution? We got 3 minutes. Super easy. The whole essence of the Enlightenment is about rights, right? Rights and freedom. Right? And so that means, in terms of economics, state control versus no state control. Which is more free? Super easy.
Oh, no state control?
Obviously, okay. So, it's a spectrum. So if you remember even a little bit about American history, in order for the Virginia colony to be formed, what did the colonists have to secure before they went out? Same thing, before the Pilgrims went out to New England, what did they have to secure before they went out? Charter, which is basically a royal authorization. Is the crown sending troops out there? No. These are individual people. But individual private people cannot do things on their own in 1600. Remember, 1600, this is James I. So we have a spectrum. The first push is to remove that. A guy named Adam Smith. And he is writing basically in the late 1700s. I don't remember the exact date, but I'm just going to put 1790. Wealth of Nations is this book. Okay? And his argument is that nations are most successful and prosperous the more free they are. And the ones that try to control everything are less prosperous. This is a concept that's causing the royals, the nobles and the wealthy peasants to go up to King Louis XVI and say, you are totally screwing up this economy. Because under Louis XVI, he had to authorize everything. Just let us be, and we will fix this. That was the first revolution in France. Now the point here is that this freedom then leads to more innovations, technical innovations, particularly when it follows on the scientific revolution, where you're solving, problem solving. Inductive reasoning is very good for problem solving of material issues. And boom, we start having factories. I will talk much more about this on Monday, and what our goal here for Monday, and I want you to read, if you haven't read about Industrial Revolution, read it. I'm assuming that most of you did. What we're going to talk about on Monday is how does industry, and what I'm really talking about is factories, and I'm talking about mercantilism. How does industry lead to colonization? And the best example of this is, I think we're doing India first, although we may be doing Middle East. Whatever your syllabus says, look at one of those examples, and what you're trying to read when you're reading is finding how does the industrialism lead to this colonization. Questions, comments, words of wisdom? Okay, we'll see you guys on Monday.